I'm here to talk about my book, Ancient Tales Newly Told. There's actually two books inside this. It's two for the price of one. The first book, which is what I'm going to focus on today, is called The Grave and the Gay, and that was published in 2012. And then in 2019, right before the pandemic, I had another book ready to go called King of Kings. And that's based on the meeting and romance between King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, told primarily from the Ethiopian tradition, which is very, very different from what you may have read in the Bible. It's a bit more salacious. So I decided to put them together in one volume because they are ancient texts, which I newly told. But yes, I'm going to focus on the earlier book, Grave and the Gay, primarily because it takes place in the springtime, around Easter, and I just feel like we're all very impatient for spring to finally come. We get a peek of it, and then it's winter again, and so I have a feeling that we're all just really wanting spring, so that's why I chose it. A holiday, the first one of the year. Lord Donald's wife came into the church, the gospel for to hear. And when the meeting it was done, she cast her eyes about, and there she saw little Maddie Groves walking in the crowd. Come home with me, little Maddie Groves, come home with me tonight. Come home with me, little Maddie Groves, and sleep with me till light. Oh, I can't come home, I won't come home and sleep with you tonight. By the rings on your fingers I can tell you are Lord Donald's wife. But if I am Lord Donald's wife, Lord Donald's not at home. He is out in the far cornfields bringing the yearlings home. And a servant who was standing by and hearing what was said, he swore Lord Donald would know before the sun would set. So begins a 17th century English folk ballad, known originally as Little Musgrave and Lady Barnard, but that over the generations and through multiple variants has become known today as Maddie Groves. It's a classic tale of a scandalous tryst leading to, you're really shocked by this, leading to adultery and murder. You know, they always say, write what you know, so. So, why did I just choose to write a book about this old song? Fact is, I was dared. I was dared in late October of 2006. And I know that it was late October 2006 because November was just a day or two away, and November is National Novel Writing Month, known as Nanowrimo. And this is a national, probably international, initiative to get people to write the book that they've always meant to write but never took the time to write. So from November 1st to November 30th, you're supposed to put in the effort to write a 25,000 word novel. And a day or two before November, a colleague of mine dared me to write a book. And I said, sure, why not? Trouble is, I didn't feel like I had a book that I'd been meaning to write, so I didn't know what to write about. But I did know this song, and I knew it from this album. This album came out in 1969. It's by a British folk rock group called Fairport Convention. It's a very influential album, actually, because it really melded British folk with rock and roll. And there's a couple of notable members of this group. The lead singer, Sandy Denny, is known best for having written the song Who Knows Where the Time Goes, that Judy Collins had a big hit with. And also she's the female singer with Robert Plant on Led Zeppelin's Battle of Evermore. And then the lead guitarist is a guy named Richard Thompson, who's considered one of the great guitarists. And he's still active. Sandy Denny unfortunately died several years ago. So I had the song, and I had the dare, but how was I going to turn what is essentially a 4-minute song? On the record it's 8 minutes. It's 4 minutes of singing and 4 minutes of a hot instrumental jam. How do you take a 4-minute song and turn it into a novel? Well, I knew I was going to need to do some research and learn more about it. Excuse me. So again, I knew it was a 17th century English folk ballad, and I Googled this song, and I found out that it was originally cataloged by this guy named Francis James Child, who was a 19th century professor of rhetoric at Harvard. He was born in Boston and actually is buried in Stockbridge. And last summer we went to visit his grave, which was actually a bit of a thrill for me. What I found out was that he went to England to collect all these popular ballads, and he came out with a 10-volume series called English and Scottish Popular Ballads. And Little Musgrave and Lady Barnard, aka Maddie Groves, is known as Child 81 because it is the 81st entry in the catalog. And there were actually 14 variants, because you can picture, you know, troubadours or whomever going from village to village singing these songs, changing the names as they go around, adding things to them in the folk tradition. So I went back to the album to play it again, and lo and behold, inside the gatefold is a picture of Francis James Child, for which it says, "It is largely thanks to Professor Francis James Child, 1825 to 1896, that so many British ballads are known to us today. Born in Boston, Child came to England, and the result of his studies was English and Scottish popular ballads, the definitive collection never to be superseded." So I had that to go on. The next big thing that any book needs and any author needs to know is the setting of the story, the time and place. So I knew England and I knew 17th century. I didn't know much more than that, but looking back at the lyrics, you know, in the first verse, a holiday, the first one of the year, Lord Donald's wife came into the church, the gospel for to hear. So I knew that it was a religious holiday and the first one of the year. I deduced it was Easter, which is great because Easter and spring, there is so much symbolism in that time period of, you know, birth and rebirth. It's a transitional season. There's a lot of, I knew there was a lot of literary things I could do just in that season. So I decided to look up any sort of Easter time customs of the day. And this wonderful record cover helped me along. Over here is a group of oddly dressed characters called pace eggers, for which it says, "Pace egging, an Easter custom in the northwest of England, uses the egg as a symbol of the springtime rebirth of life. Another symbolic rebirth depiction, the mummers' play, is sometimes performed by the pace eggers as they go a-begging for eggs." So then I started researching pace egging, and I found out some interesting things about that sort of custom, as well as the lyrics to a full pace egging song, which I reproduce in the story. But you know, the cool thing about that said it was a custom of northwest England, so that gave me a place to focus on. So I took out a map of England. I looked in the northwest. I found Lancashire County, and so there I had the time, I had the place, I had everything I needed. But I only have 4 characters in this song, and for a novel I'm going to need a lot more. So I've got Maddie, I've got the Lord and the Lady, and the unnamed tattletale servant. Now, as I said, there were lots of variants, lots of different names. I decided to use the original, from the original ballad collected here. So Maddie Musgrave and Lord and Lady Barnard, and I called the servant Darnell because that was a name used in another variant. So I had to create backstories for all these characters, but also I needed more characters. And one of the things that I was thinking about as I was trying to take the information that I knew from the lyrics and just the need to create action and subplots and characters was, why is Lady Barnard, why does she have the hots for Maddie to begin with? And I figured it could be either he's totally a handsome hunk, or maybe she's got a bad marriage. And I thought, well, I'll just do both. Cause why not? Because I've never written a book before. Well, let's just do it. So to sort of establish Maddie as being a handsome hunk, I didn't want to just have it because of Lady Barnard being attracted to him. So I wanted to create a character who is basically his love interest that he's had on and off, and through that, really show that Maddie is a man of great appeal. So I created this character which I named Alexander McLean. Why did I call her Alexandra McLean? That's the real name of Sandy Denny. And so they have been lovers, but he's also been with other people, and she's been with other people. She's a very independent woman for the time period. She owns her sexuality. And you know, I like like to think that she gives as good as she gets, and that's one thing that draws them together, because they're not, you know, linked. They're not totally linked. They feel they can be independent. So I had that character, and that created these other opportunities. So Darnell the servant is also attracted to Alexandra, but he's also got a thing for Lady Barnard, and Lady Barnard has a thing for Maddie, and Maddie's got a thing for Alexandra. And then there's the Lord, who has some interesting interplay in here as well. Now, I was very familiar with the song. It's not the most, obviously, the best known album in the world. Hello.
There's some seats here. Yeah, there's 2 seats up front. Seats up front.
Hello. Come on, sure. Okay, to start over again from the beginning. Yeah. So I was, one of the fears I had when I was writing the book was, well, what if somebody knows the song, then they're going to know the ending. So I made up a different ending. And basically it took me 3 years to write this book. It took me another 3 years to rewrite it and to find someone to publish it. And in that time, I created even a final chapter. And probably if it was never published, I'd still be working on it to this day. But it finally was, and so it's done. And so I wanted to read some of it for you today. And again, I chose it to read today because it's not my latest book, but it's the one that is set in spring, and we're all dying to have spring. I see winter coats everywhere. It's already April. So the book begins with Lady Barnard waking up in the morning and realizing that spring has sprung. And it's been a terrible winter for her because, again, her marriage is terrible. And she's just wanting some excuse to be hopeful. And she finds it in the weather and in the changing season. So, so the excerpt that I'm going to read focuses on that. Darkness, stillness, silence. Then cool air against exposed flesh, causing in the bed a slow rustle, a sightless reach for the goose feather blanket. From this sudden instinctive response, Lady Barnard's eyes roll up beneath their lids. The darkness no longer is absolute. It shifts gradually from black to brown, from red to orange. Eventually there is light entering the room, sunlight stirring her emerging consciousness. Now voices, muffled, but not just voices, songs, birds. Her eyes open. Like a bear winter denning, she arises, aroused by the siren call of appetite. For after a long lethargic winter, the air finally felt like spring. Could it be? Yes, it must. The calendar had promised. Each day had been a little warmer, a shade brighter. And now, at long last, she realized in her still waking mind, spring is here. Convinced it was true, Lady Barnard sprung from her bed and strode towards her window. As her face hovered near the glass, nearly pressed against it, her exuberant breath created a moist fog on the interior-facing pane. Impatiently, she wiped the moisture with her hand, revealing only that the window's exterior was still wet with countless silver ovals of morning dew that the young day's low sun had yet to dry. Not to be denied the sight and smell she craved, Lady Barnard thrust her small pale hands at the wooden bolts that had kept the window closed tightly against the winter chill and struggled to work them loose. It took a few moments, for they had not been disturbed for a number of months, but at last she succeeded. Shedding for a moment her well-practiced gentility, Lady Barnard flung open the window, and into her face flew the long-awaited guest. That southwesterly wind that clipped the green fields of Dublin carried the moist, mossy aroma of peat over the Atlantic Ocean and round the Isle of Anglesey, and at last deposited this time-worn trace of spring to the thawing English county of Lancashire and into Lady Barnard's bedroom. Never mind that one's breath was still clearly visible at dawn and in the evenings, or that fires, as much for warmth as for cooking, still burned in people's hearths. No, impatience prevailed, and folks were already out and about, preparing for the Eastertime celebrations to come. Of course, in spring, impatience is nothing if not a virtue. After all, it is the impatience of the crocus pushing through the damp, softening soil that calls nature again to life. It is the impatience of the sun, no longer intent to give way to darkness so soon after supper, that gives light and thus encouragement to all human and natural pursuits. And it is the impatience of time itself, that stands not a day longer in a single season than it must, because tomorrow is never inevitable, and each day, each season is a gift to the earth and all who live upon it. In this season, rich with tradition, small bands of enterprising young men gathered in taverns, on porches, in fields, and even in the rear pews on Sunday mornings, enlisting like-minded merrymakers to join their pace-egging troops. Pace, of course, is from the Latin pacha, or spring, and eggs are the common symbol of rebirth. In this part of the country, the pace-eggers journey from town to town each Easter Sunday in wild costumes, and with a song of entreaty, request favors, usually eggs boiled in onion skin or coins of any value, in return for which they enact a farcical play. It was in this happy and hopeful atmosphere that Lady Barnard drew the fresh, peaty air deeply into her nostrils, and in exhaling released a winter's worth of loneliness and frustration. The crisp, invigorating breeze felt good on her alabaster face. Framed as ever by dark, straight hair she often drew tightly at the back in a bun. As she had just arisen, though, it now fell randomly about her shoulders, with a few black strands strewn across her face. She closed her eyes, savoring the moment, and then opened them to see which persons were out in the crisp, clean air. What Lady Barnard saw first were the few servants her husband employed out in the yard, going about their morning chores, raking, sweeping, pruning, planting, mending, washing. She also saw townspeople passing her grand home on the winding dirt road. By all accounts, a typical morning sight, but today, instead of white, the endless, hopeless white of cold and imposing snow, there were colorful figures in motion against a deepening green and brown background. Faces were uncovered, revealing pleasant-looking people with things to do and the will to do them, not bundled creatures too cold to socialize, rushing from one hearth to another. I bid you welcome, spring, she thought to herself, and may winter not soon return. That's how it begins, and soon enough she spies Maddie in the yard, and then everything happens. That is as much as I had prepared to tell you about that book. There is, as I say, another book, a more recent book about King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba that I'd be happy to talk about if you have any questions about it. And also look back in some number of weeks. There will be another book that I've written called Villainy Ever After, and that is a collection of classic fairy tales told from the perspective of the villains, illustrated beautifully by Naomi Kahn, and we'll be very excited to have that offered here at the gallery as well. At this time, I really need some water, and I'd be happy to take any questions from anyone. Yes, sir.
So you alluded to the plot eventually devolving or evolving into murder or murderous elements. Sort of, what was your process? What was your process for going in that direction, as opposed to some other, based on the information you had, from the lyrics and the lore, and why didn't it turn into a reaffirming of romance between the Lord and Lady, as opposed to somebody getting murdered?
Who gets murdered? Yes. So partly, I guess one thing that made this sort of easy for a first novel is that I was working from a story that existed already. So I had the bones. I knew where it was going. As I filled in that skeleton with plots and action and characters, different things arose that are not in the song. Different loyalties and attractions, and I saw interesting opportunities with some of the new characters that I created to interject themselves into the what is the trajectory of the song that takes it sort of off course. So yes, in the original song, there is a murder, But in my story, there is perhaps more than one murder. And there are connections and linkages and relationships that spring together that one might not have expected early in the story, or that exist in the song at all. So for me, being someone who considers himself more of a nonfiction kind of guy, I've always read more nonfiction. I'm a copywriter. And I've written nonfiction. Having to do research was really something that I enjoyed, and having to use my imagination to go beyond what I had as my blueprint was also an interesting challenge. And like I said, if it hadn't been picked up by a publisher, I would still be working on it, because there's any number of things that could have gone in and would have. So it was basically just a creative challenge.
Did you write it in linear fashion, or did you write like a chunk here and write a chunk there and then put it together, or what's your process for that?
Yeah, good question. So when I first sat down to write this, I was thinking, oh, this is great. I'm going to play the song that it's based on, and I'm going to write to it. So the song ended, and I had like 7 words. And I said, okay, well, let's see what happens at the end of the album. At the end of the album, I had 25 words. So I said, well, this is going to be a longer process than I thought. Now, I've seen pictures from authors, and they've got like boards up, and they've got stickies, and they've got this character and that thing, and we got something over here, and it's like a whole kind of cubist thing going on about how they're plotting out the story. I don't know how to do that, but I didn't have to do that because I had the story down. And so for me, it was a matter of starting at the beginning and going towards the end by way of the middle. It's the only way I knew how to do it. But like I said, after I reached the end, I started the rewrites, and I went back to the beginning. And then you sort of see there's holes here and there, or things that that should be moved around a little bit. There's this great sort of truism in book authorship that if you get rid of your first 3 chapters, that's the real start of your story, because writers tend to want to show off how well they write, so they create these elaborate introductions and stuff. Guilty as charged. And so if you cut out that and start with the action, that's typically the way you want to go. And like I said, I did at one point decide that my ending wasn't ending enough, and came up with another ending. So it originally was a linear process, but then afterwards it was a little more, spackling, filling in the cracks.
Did you have to have a literary agent, or did you just publish?
It was published by a small publisher who doesn't require
An agent?
an agent, yeah. Yes, sir.
With the 2 stories in here, was it an intentional decision to combine them, or was it you just had 2 stories and figured to put them together, or was there a link, or intentionally or unintentionally, I guess?
No, yeah, good question. So, yeah, I had the first book, and wasn't sort of planning a second book, but really I was still in the throes of the first book when I heard another song that inspired another book, and I'll just tell that briefly. So there's this jazz singer, Cassandra Wilson, whom I like very much, and she has an album called Blue Moon Daughter, and there's a song on that called Solomon Sang. And I was reading the lyrics, and I could tell from the lyrics that the Solomon in question was King Solomon, because it talks about having wisdom untold and all these treasures, and this queen came, and asked questions, and then there's a line in one of the verses says, and when he lay down with Makeda, Solomon sang. And I never heard the name Makeda used in relation to King Solomon or anywhere. I looked that up and found out it was the Ethiopian name for the Queen of Sheba, and that the Ethiopians have their own historical and theological book that really all their emperors right into the 20th century with Haile Selassie I traced their lineage back to the union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, which I found really interesting. But so once I finished, the Grave and the Gay, I went full force into that book. And once I finished that, I was like, well, I got 2 historical novels based on ancient texts, both inspired by a song. I just felt they sort of belonged together, and I think that at the original pop-up, so when we did the Pechakucha thing, or however you pronounce it, Pechakucha. I did a presentation about both the stories, and that was the first time I used the title Ancient Tales Newly Told, because I saw the connection between the 2, and I just felt they belonged in a single volume. Also, there were some typos and corrections in the first book that I wanted to correct, so that gave me an opportunity to come out with a swell new volume. And I think the 2 stories, even though one's biblical times and one's 17th century, one's Israel and Ethiopia, and the other is Northwest England, I still think they sort of come together.
Yeah, you get that royalty, nobility.
You got that,
connection to
people
it.
in charge, acting badly, which is an evergreen idea. Yes. Nobody gets slapped in either of these stories. though. Yes, Osa.
Can you imagine a 3rd story that would fit into that collection?
It's funny you say that, because after the fact I began to think intentionally, what's another song that can inspire me to do something that's, fits in this? And I didn't come up with one, but I'm a member of the Malden Writers Group here, and one of the writing prompts that we had at one meeting 2 or 3 years ago was to write a fairy tale from the perspective of the villain. So I took that on, and I did a retelling of Little Red Riding Hood told from the Big Bad Wolf. And that went over well, and this was the pandemic, and I had time on my hands, so I wrote a dozen more of those. And it really wasn't until I was sort of done with that I realized I had done another Ancient Tales Newly Told type thing. Fairy tales go back, several centuries from all over the world. And I realized without even trying to that I had copied myself again. I do have another book after that, which is not an ancient tale at all. But that's too early to talk about.
I probably have a question. When it comes to characters, do you like to work with the characters who existed, or you like more to create the additional characters on your own and give them a personality? So what do you like better?
In the case of Maddie,
Yeah.
I needed someone who was kind of a ladies' man, who had feature. I describe him in the book, and I had a friend of mine in mind as I was describing him. I really rooted him in this guy that I know. I don't know if he sees himself in that character or not, but for me, it was helpful to have a reference point. There were other characters that I just sort of created out of whole cloth. The character of Alexandra, his lover, was someone that I sort of just imagined, but she's the one that sort of eventually became most real to me. And there's a point where she has some troubles, and when I wrote that scene and got to the end of it and moved on, and then came back to it later, I said, that was too easy. I was trying to protect her. And I said, I have to trust that she can handle, if I give her a harder, sort of ordeal to go through. And I did that, and that was, and then it turned out that, she had long curly hair and everything, and then I met Naomi. And I was like, well, look, there she is. So, yeah, like everything else, a blend of basing it in something real and just using our imagination. The books are for sale. I'm happy to sign them. Whether you buy or not, there are free bookmarks. And I just really am grateful that you came out to hear me today.